It's my feel-good breakfast show.
It is your Feel Good Breakfast Show, Expresso, and open up to new possibilities and new information. And we're talking all things pets this morning. But before we turn to the whole keeping exotic wild animals as pets, is it actually a good idea? Is it even allowed? And Dr. Andrew Taylor, the manager of the Endangered Wildlife Trust's Wildlife in Trade program, joined us for a couple of answers that I think that we all could actually hear right now. Dr. Andrew Taylor, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
It's good to have you. Good to see you. I'm wondering, is that a real bird behind you or not? Looks pretty surreal to me. I love that background.
Yeah,
man.
it's just a photo.
Well played, man. So look, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's great to have you. And I'm going to dive straight into it and ask you, what is exactly an exotic or alien animal versus something like an indigenous animal?
Yeah, so an indigenous animal or an indigenous species is one that occurs naturally in an area. So within South Africa, that would be a species that has occurred here naturally, historically, and that has not been introduced by humans. So examples could be things like lions, elephants, vervet monkeys, blue cranes. In the reptile sector, things like sun gazer, lizards. Those would be indigenous species. And then exotic or alien species, those are ones that are not indigenous. So they did not occur naturally in an area historically. And generally they've been introduced by humans, sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose. And very obvious examples would be things like tigers, capuchin monkeys. In the bird section, things like common miners. So people in Joburg will be very familiar with common miners. They're actually exotic species. And in the pet section, something like hedgehog tenrecs. So you go into a pet shop and you see what looks like a hedgehog, and it's actually not a hedgehog, it's a tenrec from Madagascar.
So when I look at pop culture, we see this in the movies. You mentioned tiger and you mentioned a certain monkey. Those are both in the Hangover movie. Of course, this kind of affects people. But I think it's important for us to understand what are examples of threatened exotic animals, just to educate ourselves before we make very, very poor decisions on the type of pets we keep.
Yeah, so, I mean, a threatened species is one that has been determined by, so there's a world organization called the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they have a process they call the red listing process, which does an assessment of the level of threat of a species in the wild. So I think commonly known species examples would be things like rhinos, pandas, tigers. Those are things that are very threatened in the wild. And so if we're talking about a threatened exotic species, it could be something like a tiger, for example. So they don't occur here, so they're exotic, but we do have them here. Some people keep them here as pets, but they're very highly threatened in the wild. So, you know, if you're involved with something like a pet trade that includes tigers, and that tiger has been taken out of the wild, that you could be contributing towards the threat status of that species.
Wow, this is interesting stuff. Now, I've seen some crazy stuff online where people are like showcasing a tiger as a pet or some sort of a crazy exotic animal. So do you need some sort of a permit to keep an exotic wild animal as a pet? And what are some of the current legal regimes that are in place with this whole space?
So it actually, funnily enough, it depends on which province you're in. So some of the provinces, including Gauteng, for example, you do not actually need a permit to keep an exotic animal, just in terms of keeping it sort of in your house. So that might seem very strange, but that is the case for 4 of the provinces. But there are other 5 provinces, the southern provinces, so the Capes and the Free State and KZN, you do require a permit. But sorry, what was the second part of your question again?
So I just wanted to ask you, are there any sort of like regimes involved, like when I actually want to have a pet? You're saying it's fine that we can keep them if we are in Gauteng and the southern areas.
Yeah.
What?
So legally speaking, so there's national legislation around wildlife, and then there is provincial legislation. And the national legislation doesn't actually cover wildlife as pets. And I think that's probably something that needs to be addressed. But so the provinces are the ones that do that. So 4 of the provinces don't really require permits for keeping exotic pets. Yeah.
So, of course, we do have a part two, and I think it's important for us to talk about some of the consequences legally if people are oblivious to the rules and keeping exotic animals. So, Dr. Andrew Taylor, thank you very much for joining us. And, of course, we'll pick up on this conversation a little later with regard to these exotic, wild, and endangered animals being kept as pets on Expresso. So, stick around for part two.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Yeah, welcome back, you beautiful souls. You're still locked in. It's S3. We're opening up live right here on Expresso, and we're continuing the conversation with Dr. Andrew Taylor, the manager of the Endangered Wildlife Trust's Wildlife in Trade program. Now, he's talking about keeping exotic animals and pets. Is it a good idea or not? And what are the rules behind it all? Well, let's find out.
So, Dr. Andrew Taylor, I want to pick up part two just by asking about the legalities around keeping a wild animal. If one doesn't have a permit, what are the consequences?
Yeah, so if you don't have a permit and you're caught without the permit, then you basically committed an offence and you can be prosecuted. It would generally happen under provincial legislation, but yeah, depending on which species you've got and the severity of the offence, it could be either a fine or it could even be imprisonment.
Wow. So my question is exactly why would people even want to keep exotic pets in the first place? I mean, apart from that, I would guess like a show-off factor.
Yeah.
What is the actual reason? I mean, why even do it in the first place?
Yeah, I think show-off factor is one thing that applies to some people. I think in many cases people think they're cute, especially when they're small. Baby wild animals tend to be considered very cute. So yeah, I think and very cool. People think they're cool, and some of them are. If you have things like monkeys, intelligent animals, they can be quite entertaining to have around.
Oh wow!
So yeah, I think it depends on the person. But yeah, to me it seems a bit weird to want to have a wild animal with you. But yeah, there's lots of reasons.
I think if you don't educate yourself, you're actually being quite selfish to the animal. You're not really actually thinking about its needs and its habitat. So what are the potential problems with keeping wild animals as pets? I mean, what are the ethical issues you need to consider? I think this is a vital thing for people to hear who are, as mentioned earlier, oblivious to the rules.
Yeah, so there are quite a few. I think, first of all, if you don't know what you're doing with the animal, if you don't have a sort of an understanding of the needs of the animal, then you're going to come short in terms of providing what the animal needs. So you need to know what kind of food it needs to eat. You need to know the sort of social interactions that it needs, whether it needs those things, what kind of exercise it needs, the space that it needs. So very often people are ignorant of the needs of wild species, and they don't get them right. And so then the animal suffers, and there are animal welfare issues. Then a second and really important issue is, where does the animal come from? So if it's been taken out of the wild and you're not aware of that, you could be contributing to increasing the level of threat to that species. So, for example, something like an African grey parrot, if it could come from a reputable dealer, but if the animal has actually been taken out of the wild, then you could be contributing towards sort of biodiversity loss. And then another really important issue is things like monkeys, for example. You could raise a monkey from a baby monkey, and it'll be fine when that as a baby. But as it becomes adult and goes through sort of the wild puberty, so to speak, they can become very aggressive. So they can actually become very hard to handle. And of course, some wild species are very dangerous. People keep venomous snakes; they can be lethal.
Jeez, yeah. Well, it sounds like it's definitely education that's at the top of the list when it comes to obtaining or just handling an exotic animal. So my question would be then, if someone was hard set on obtaining or just having a pet or an exotic animal as a pet, where could they firstly educate themselves correctly on the practice of keeping it? And where could they then legally potentially obtain an exotic animal permit or an animal just so that it is safe and it is the right way about doing it?
Yeah, so you need to, first of all, would need to go through a reputable dealer, someone that's legal. So do a bit of research into where you would want to get the animal from. Then there's obviously, there are plenty of online resources, but you could, if you were struggling to do that, you could get hold of the Endangered Wildlife Trust, for example. But there are other places online that you could get hold of as well, and much information online in books. To help you do that. And then, I think reputable dealers would be places that you would need to look for and just make sure that they're doing things above board. So do a bit of background research into that.
So I think on a South African perspective, we need to know because as you mentioned, there's a little ignorance. You'll have somebody, something in the backyard and it's exotic, but you're just thinking, it's just an animal. We live in South Africa. Sometimes it gets a bit wild here. So what are the South African animals that are endangered that we need to be looking out for and perhaps educating each other about, neighbors, friends, and so it goes?
So, South Africans, you mean sort of indigenous species, South African species that people
Correct.
keep as pets?
Yes, correct.
Cool.
So what are some of the endangered ones so we know that we can't keep those as pets, so to speak?
Right. Okay, so I think what I didn't mention, and I realized I forgot to say it, and it's very important, while some provinces don't have a permitting system for exotic species, you are not allowed to keep local indigenous species yourself unless you have you'd have to have very specific permitting for that.
Okay.
You'd probably have to be some kind of institution like a zoo or a game farm or something that would be allowed to do that. So you actually cannot keep, as a personal pet, you cannot keep indigenous species. So I would say that's probably the best thing to say. You don't do it.
Oh, nice.
There we go. And it's good that you said that. I think that's exactly what I wanted to evoke. If you want to, get any more information, there are some website resources for you. So, please take a look around and educate yourself before we do our thing. And I mean, the thing is, yes, it's nice to keep an exotic animal, but at the same time, it is actually very, very important that you understand all of the parameters around it as well. That's important.
It definitely is indeed. Get yourself educated and get yourself primed up so that you are doing your part and obviously conserving, which is the primary task at hand.